So, as I promised, we are going to go on and move probably fairly quickly through just some of the features of the EPA review for the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, and then also the National Toxicology Program monograph. And my goal is just to, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but just to help you get your arms around what is in these documents and kind of what they might offer you. So this slide, which you probably had a chance to look at, just talks a bit about the basis for why EPA is undertaking this review, and the fact that the Science Advisory Board, Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, is empowered to provide comments and charged with an independent scientific review of it. So the schedule, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but they had a first draft in May of 2011, got reviewed, went back to the drawing board, came back in February, they EPA, with the revised ISA, Integrated Science Assessment. And there are comments, and you can find all these things on the web. You can find the science assessment on the air program's website, but it's actually often most instructive to go to the EPA Science Advisory Board website, and if you can find reference then to this review, you can also find comments that have been submitted by various parties, which are informative and useful to review. And so there are minutes of the Science Advisory Board meetings there, and there also is their June draft letter, which I'm not sure that they've actually officially transmitted to the air programs. But if the bottom part, the next step for EPA in this rulemaking is the policy assessment and the final rulemaking, and those dates that are in there are all before EPA figured out they were going to have to do a third draft, as opposed to having a final document in August, this past August, which is what they had optimistically anticipated. So moving on, this is just basically the key chapters in the table of contents. And the parts, they have a review of ecological effects that most of you may not be that interested in, and a lot of issues related to air, linking air-lead to how you evaluate exposures from the air. But for our purposes of what I'm focusing on today, it's Chapter 5, which is supposed to be integrating the reviews of health effects and exposure, and then kind of a summary in Chapter 2. So I'll give a few highlights from that. They do purport to make causal associations and determine whether there's a link between these categories of effects. But this is a really kind of high level, and they do in the document get into some more specifics, because it gets complicated, as usually is the case when you get into some of the details. So I've just put a few of their primary conclusions up here, just for information. And this is the one: the cognitive function decrements and effects on IQ and academic performance are things that that we've all been talking about, and they conclude there's a sufficient body of evidence that there's a causal relationship. But again, we're not talking dose response here. We're just talking whether or not this group determined there was a causal relationship. Similarly, immune system effects. They talk about stimulation of Th2 responses. I probably need to explain that. We have in our immune system the white cells, we have B cells and T cells, and in the T cells we have T1, T2 cells, and so this stimulation of T2 cells triggers a cascade that shifts some of the immune response, so that you could potentially end up with increased incidence of asthma or allergic reactions. So it's and IgE is involved in that step, and so you'll see later NTP talks about IgE while they talk about Th2, but basically we've got evidence of immunomodulatory effects, and the link gets weaker when we try to actually say, oh, what disease is this causing or responsible for? What health effect in the population we're looking at? Cardiovascular effects, we're primarily talking about adults here and long-term lead exposure. And they're talking particularly about associations of lead with increased blood pressure and hypertension. But they do acknowledge in this latest draft uncertainty regarding the level, timing, frequency, and duration of exposure, contributing to the observed associations. So there's a causal relationship, but it's, again, this long paragraph suggests, well, it's kind of complicated. They also have, I didn't highlight, Chapter 6 talks about at-risk concepts. And this stems from the fact that the National Ambient Air Quality primary standards are very focused on identifying sensitive populations. And so, as we all know, for lead, childhood is a well-established at-risk life stage, meaning more susceptible. And I just thought this table that they provide is kind of useful in compiling some of these factors conceptually. So you've got physiological factors that influence lead internal distribution. We talked about being in the bone or the blood, and actually there's a lot of complicated stuff about in the blood. Is it in the plasma or in the red blood cells? But certainly some of those things vary with age, genetics, nutrition, and potentially at some levels with co-exposures to other things. And I'm going to actually, on the right, factors potentially related to increased risk of lead-induced health effects. So it's really susceptibility. And here we've got a long list of factors. And lifestyle factors I didn't put in the detail on, but it includes alcohol consumption, smoking, obesity, for example. In the middle here, we've got some of the, maybe a shorter list, but some really important factors. That population characteristics potentially related to differential exposure. And all of these factors need to be considered when you're trying to interpret studies, and they have the potential to really confound your results and the interpretation. So again, here we see we've got age at play all across here, sex, race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status is a huge factor in trying to interpret these studies. And then the one that I've bolded is residential factors, and that, we have these multitude of varying sources that can be present in the home environment that need to be considered. So the June comments from the Science Advisory Board Committee did find still some significant deficiencies in the document, that it didn't consistently and transparently apply the causal framework to the analysis. And the causal determination and analysis requires a substantial revision. So this suggests that this may not be a small undertaking for EPA to produce their third version of this document. If they really are going to comply with some of these reassessments that are specifically recommended. And so I just point out, I don't need to go through this, but I think it's useful for you to have a slide like this for reference, that they did specify the systematic and critical, the elements that need to be systematically and critically evaluated to establish causation. And as I said, this document of EPA's is a huge compilation of literature, but it is weak in following all these steps to support their conclusions. And there are just some additional comments that I thought were a nice summary from the May 10th and 11th meeting minutes. Again, kind of restating and pointing out for their causation analysis that behavior outcomes and renal outcomes need improvement in that discussion. They're talking here about the long-term exposure and cardiovascular endpoints really at higher blood lead concentrations than we're talking about when we talk about the new reference level. And then they recommended that EPA should focus their discussion on the low-level lead effect towards the endpoints of cognitive decrements in children and adverse cardiovascular effects in adults. And I think that's the end of that section. So moving on to the National Toxicology Program Review, this is a smaller document without an exhaustive reference list, so it relies quite extensively on other reviews. This was undertaken at the request of at least lead was nominated for a review by the National Toxicology Program by NIOSH. So they were specifically interested in reproductive and developmental effects of lead because that pertains to their goal of protecting workers. And, but then the National Toxicology Program expanded the scope to include children as well as adults in multiple health endpoints. And the difference in what distinguishes the National Toxicology Program Review is that they really try to focus on evidence that effects are present less when blood lead levels are less than 10, that there are still effects present. Some of the way they present their data is not completely intuitive, but and then they further subdivide it. I think I've got a slide. These are the key questions they had. They're looking the first cut is effects below 10 micrograms per deciliter, but then here on this third bullet, they actually do break it out between evidence for effects even when blood lead levels are below 5 versus what additional effects do you see when the blood lead levels are below 10. And so I'll present some summary tables that they've got. And they break it out. They look separately at children and adults. And they also try to determine if bone lead data provides an additional source of evidence of these associations. And this is their classification scheme. Is there sufficient evidence of an association, meaning that the association is observed in which chance, bias, and confounding could be ruled out with reasonable confidence? That's their standard. If there's limited evidence of an association, then that chance, bias, and confounding could not be ruled out with reasonable confidence. If there was insufficient evidence, that's what they called it, inadequate evidence of an association. And conversely, if there was adequate evidence of no association. So those are the classifications that they applied. So I've got just 4 tables here. One is on health effects in children when the blood lead levels are less than 5. Then the next one's health effects in children when the blood lead levels are less than 10. And then the same set of 2 slides for adults. So as you can see here, they determined there was sufficient evidence for decreased academic achievement, IQ, and specific cognitive measures, and increased incidence of attention-related behaviors and problem behaviors, with also some bone lead evidence. So these are all based on blood lead evidence or toxicology studies. Limited evidence for delayed puberty, and when children are greater than or equal to 12 years of old, decreased kidney function. When we move on to the less than 10 microgram per deciliter category, they move delayed puberty into the sufficient category and also decreased hearing. And then we pick up limited evidence for hypersensitivity and allergy, and inadequate evidence then for asthma, eczema, as you can read down the list, and renal effects in children less than 12. That seems to be a cutoff for identifying renal effects in children. Moving on to adults, when blood lead levels are less than 5, they concluded there was sufficient evidence of decreased glomerular filtration rate, so that translates to being an effect on the kidneys, for those of you who may not have the details of the toxicology. There's also evidence, they say, sufficient evidence of maternal blood lead associated with reduced fetal growth and associated bone lead data. and then limited evidence of essential tremor. And then the last table is now you see they've moved the essential tremor over into the sufficient category, and also sufficient evidence for increased blood pressure and increased risk of hypertension, again with bone data. And then, as you can see, there are quite a few additional effects where there's only limited evidence in adults for things like psychological effects, cognitive function, hearing, ALS, cardiovascular, spontaneous abortion and preterm birth. And then I think it's equally important to pay attention to these categories where they say there's inadequate evidence of an association, including immune function, stillbirth, birth defects, etc. So this document, excuse me, is quite useful in providing an overview and a cut at the literature from which you can start figuring out how to focus. So my last two slides are just kind of a summary to try to wrap this up a little bit and get you keyed up for when we get to the question part, and a few additional stray thoughts. So I just repeat up there for your reference what's been going on with the CDC, key points, and EPA with this lead assessment, but then in the purple, just noting that this is a separate comment from the lead assessment, that just reminding this issue that we don't exactly know yet how this reference level is going to be applied, and I deal most often with issues related to EPA, so I'm really anxious to see what kind of guidance they're going to issue for how we consider this new reference level. I've actually already seen a proposed plan that has this reference level in it for a Superfund site, so it's starting to creep in, and when I deal with state health departments, they're all on to using the 5 micrograms per deciliter, although they really don't know what it means yet or how they're going to deal with it, but they've got it in their radar. And then this is, we just talked about the NTP study. So last slide, just kind of this really is a few additional stray thoughts, and I probably could have come up with a lot more if I hadn't kind of run out of time thinking about this, but just again to point out that this reference level is a population reference value. It's not risk-based, and I suspect that's something we're going to want to talk about in the questions and answers. Why is that, and what is the implication of that? So basically, the definition of elevated blood lead levels is based on the upper end of the population. So it's the upper 2.5% of children, and that's just defined to be elevated. And that's been, the rationale from the CDC was that basis for defining an elevated level has been used before on a population basis. Just the importance of thinking about population data, which I talked about how the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey gives you this carefully designed, nationally representative database. It actually also can give you regional data, but it can't necessarily give you representative state data, and it certainly isn't going to give you representative community data. So if you're looking for more focused populations, for comparison populations, for example, which down here, they're really, really hard to come up with comparison population if you are trying to figure out if blood lead levels in one community are higher than in another, or if they vary across neighborhoods. So this, you often resort to surveillance data, which I talked about being collected by states and health departments, and you really have to look at all these issues at the bottom, both for if you're looking at surveillance data, but also then if you've got individual blood lead levels that you need to interpret, be careful. I'm sure that it seems like this would be a primary thing that all of you might be dealing with, but as I mentioned, finger stick methods versus venous samples. We call venous samples kind of the gold standard for blood lead data. The analytical detection limits vary widely, and they're really crucial, as having low detection limits is crucial. As we get to these, the NHANES study, their detection limits are down to 0.25 micrograms per deciliter, whereas with finger stick, either capillary or there's a filter paper method, the best you can do usually is 1 microgram per deciliter. And as I said, some of those point-of-care kits give you only 3.3. Furthermore, laboratories, and this is something I think that was in one of the CDC recommendations, right now the laboratories are only held to a standard of plus or minus 4 micrograms per deciliter. So if you're at 5, is it 9 or is it 1 in that case? So what that translates to, in my mind, is you really need multiple blood lead samples. You can't have one point-of-time blood sample and draw a lot of conclusions about what's going on in that child or adult. So I think those are kind of the main points that I want to make, so I think I'll wind it up and pass the baton. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and I'll answer your question there regarding the plus or minus 4. That blood lead level of 5 is really 1. I will introduce our next 2 speakers. First, we will hear from Roy Rodney, who's a defense attorney here in New Orleans, and he has an extremely impressive bio, which you can read. Includes the current defense of a very significant case involving the public housing developments here in New Orleans. So you can pick his brain on that, I'm sure, later, and maybe also ask him where to get the best gumbo in town. We'll also hear from Benji Hiller, who is a staple to these conferences and lead paint litigation. 8 years ago, I was given my first lead paint case, which I think almost puts me in that newbie category compared to some of you in the crowd. And I was given the case a month before trial, and settled the jury selection, thank goodness, because it was, I had never touched a lead paint file until that point in time. And there was a conference coming up, and I signed up for it, and I remember sharing a cab with Benji, I think it was in Philadelphia, thinking, wow, like he's it for lead paint litigation, and I'm in the cab with him. So he'll have a tremendous amount of expertise to share as well.
Good morning. I want to thank the HB Lead Litigation Conference for inviting me here today. I want to thank our chairs, Brian Brown from the great Kirpelman firm from Maryland, and Patricia Ciccarelli, Brian and Kelly from New York. I am here from New Orleans. We also practice in Houston, Texas. And so I see that many of you are here from Baltimore. I understand that we have a little engagement this weekend in Houston. I'm sure my little friends will take care of that. Now, I'm always somewhat suspicious that when I'm invited as a local lawyer that it may be because of not so much of my knowledge of the specifics of lead or toxic tort, but because of my obvious knowledge of the restaurant scene here in New Orleans. And I want to let you know I don't mind. I know the differences, I know the history, so please, on behalf of myself and my firm, don't hesitate to ask if you want our recommendation. Well, what I'm going to attempt to do today is to talk a little bit about the effect of some of the recent pronouncements of the various agencies, NGOs, CDC, EPA, ISA, NTP, and all that upon us as lawyers. And in this case, most of my experience in dealing with lead has had to do with the defense, particularly of public housing authorities. We just settled our case here after many, many, many years. Secondly, I'd like to talk about some of the issues of lead in general, which my overall contention is that very little of these changes really affect what it is that we have to do and what we do as lawyers. And hopefully, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, it will give you perhaps some cause to pause to reflect upon the changes that are occurring in this area. So low-level lead exposures. When I first was contacted regarding the topic, I just was wondering, is this about giving life to a dying toxic tort? Or is this something that has more to do with the peculiar sciences of epidemiology and toxicology than it did the practice of law? You know, we've had a dramatic reduction of elevated blood lead levels in children in this country, and that's obviously as pointed out in some of the slides. And it's due primarily to regulation and to prevention. And to some extent, the role that we have as lawyers, what I call the people's direct democracy, have had an influence upon that. And the question is how do the lowering of the standards affect our practices? What effect will it have on the law as part of that justice system that results in changes in this country? Well, quite frankly, it certainly is going to add drama to the issue of damages. When you're talking about having a number that is half of the prior number, a fifth of the number before that, and it continues to go down in terms of micrograms per deciliter, and in any other measure, it's going to affect damages. I'm not sure it's going to have much of effect on how cases are tried or on the issues of causation. It certainly will change the regulation standards, and I believe we're going to see that across the country, and it's going to have an effect upon the distribution of damages in most of the cases that I'm involved in, class action litigation, whether it's for the defense and occasionally for the plaintiffs. It's going to affect how those damages are distributed. But it certainly is not going to be able to affect the fact that in the communities in this country, and particularly here in New Orleans and other places, those areas hardest hit, it's not going to lessen the number of confounders. It's not going to clear up the issue of causation. It's not going to add clarity necessarily to any of the other relationships that we have to deal with. Quite frankly, it's an abrupt about face by the CDC and so many of the other NGOs. I mean, in 2005, the CDC gave 6 reasons why it thought it should never change, or at least not change from 10 to 5 at the time. They said it would have no effective effect on public health intervention. It said it would not provide a threshold for the adverse effects that have been demonstrated at a lower level, and that issues, the lower level, in many cases, will be an arbitrary number because of laboratory testing, that the adverse effects of lead levels will continue to be subtle and will be individual, and that there were other influences in the developmental status that would make isolating the effects of lead and predicting the overall magnitude of the health effects of lead not really any different. That laboratory testing, to a great extent, would not provide the reliability at a lower level that we might expect to have, and that it would dilute efforts to provide prevention and dilute efforts to prevent and to deal with issues of exposures. So what has changed? What has changed from the 5 reasons that the CDC and others gave for not decreasing the blood lead level? I mean, quite frankly, if you look at those things, they continue to say that the evidence suggests that children from 5 to 9, that no single source of exposure predominates. That's the ACLPP's recommendation. With regards to causal determinations, quite frankly, I've seen stronger statements from the lead experts over the past 10 years than the statements they're providing now for the causal relationships. Quite frankly, they seem to be ruling out many of the maladies that have been associated with lead and providing a lesser standard for establishment of a causal relationship. They continue to use the words uncertainty regarding the level, timing, and frequency and duration of exposure, and they admit that none of that changes. That's what ISA has said. The CASAC says that, look, the document still fails to consistently and transparently apply a causal framework to the analysis of the health effects of lead on either a group or individual basis. And when you assess the weight of the evidence for causation, they provide a standard for critically evaluating the data. And you saw that slide, so I'm not going to repeat it from Dr. Schuf, but you're going to see that again if you're a plaintiff's lawyer, and you're going to use that if you're a defense lawyer. The strength of the study in accordance with the standard epidemiological hierarchy. So lawyers, we deal with that every day. The consistency in terms of the nature and strength of the observed associations, that's going to continue to be debatable. The extent to which associations arise from chance, bias, or that they are confounders, and that they've been ruled out with reasonable confidence, is that going to change on an individual basis? Certainly not. The biological plausibility of effects of low doses demonstrated by findings from toxicological investigations. In most cases, again, I think we're going to deal with the same approach that we've had to deal with cases in the past. And in some situations, it's actually going to get worse. Certainly there's been a disruption in those studies that perhaps link lead exposure to renal outcomes. Certainly there's going to be a disruption in those studies that deal with issues of delayed puberty. So certainly there's going to be a disruption in the chain of causation with regard to asthma, skin issues, and other issues. And to some extent, even though even cardiology when you're dealing with children of a particular age, nervous system disorders, and other things that experts in prior cases have consistently linked to lead exposure are now being called into question, just as others now are deemed to be sufficient, which quite frankly, I'm not particularly impressed by the sufficient standard. So what has changed from that would cause the Center for Disease Control to make an abrupt face? It doesn't necessarily, at least from a lawyer's standpoint, seem to be substantiated by the science. And how will it affect individual cases? And I think the doctor has pointed out that there's still going to be continued and varied defenses based upon collection, detection, and laboratory involvement. So has the relationship between the science and the law changed in this area? I'm not so sure. The law, epidemiology, and toxicology in the lead area has always had a long love-hate relationship, characterized by suspicion, skepticism, and often frustration on the part of the professionals involved on all sides. And if you ever read the typical deposition of a plaintiff's epidemiological or toxicological expert, you know exactly what I mean. You know the questions that are being asked time and time and time again. And if you look at the shared materials that I understand are available on the website, the cases involving causation are fairly consistent around the country. From my state of Texas, to prove causation in the lead exposure case, the plaintiffs must do more than show a substantially elevated risk. Further, if there are any other plausible causes of the injury or condition that could be negated, the plaintiffs must offer evidence excluding those cases with reasonable certainty. Martinez versus the city of San Antonio. Or in Louisiana, where lead exposure is compared to ephedra litigation, The mere assertion that lead could somehow cause the injuries that plaintiffs suffer without an actual medical examination to determine whether or not the injuries actually were incurred through lead exposure amounts to no more than mere speculation on the issue of specific causation as required by this jurisdiction. Kemp versus Metabolife International, Inc., Eastern District of Louisiana. I gotta change my glasses. I'm getting old, and I need my bifocals. So, now, is that to say, well, we're arguing that lead is a good thing? Obviously not. I mean, I think we're beyond that 100 level. So where does this disconnect between epidemiology and toxicology and this particular hostility that I tend to see in lead cases come from? I mean, it's certainly not justified based upon the overall science, whether or not you contend that there were a positive causation on the individual or group level. But over the course of my experience of 30 years, here are the various symptoms that we've seen in cases. And if you look at what the CDC and others are saying now, many of these are compromised. And we're going to get to the big one in a minute. Now, what I was saying before is that the literature, the support for the changes, does not necessarily have any effect on the confounders. In fact, when you read some of the studies, I believe they recognize the confounders more than ever. Here are the confounders that we've seen in the cases that we've been involved in and others over the course of time. And mixed in with these confounders, also some of the regular criticisms regarding issues of clarity, transparency, even all of the NGOs recognize the subtlety of it. This idea of meta-analysis, which is not unique to lead, but is certainly relied upon lead. The lead studies are quick to cite to 28,000 other pages of correlations between lead and other outcomes, and that's good. But I think if you see in a moment, if you look behind some of those studies, it only takes one or two defects in a study to render a meta-analysis problematic. And in jurisdictions where you have high standards for expert testimony, this can become very problematic. So, if you talk about using and this is in my slide presentation, you talk about using systematic reviews and meta-analysis to support regulatory decision-making for neurotoxics, I think, that's fine. If you're talking about using meta-analysis to support a legal standard, I'm not so sure. And when you talk about interpreting epidemiological studies of environmental neurotoxicity, well, again, I wish I had one of these laser pointers. Again, if you look in here, you'll see from Dr. Bellinger's study that with regard to the validity, the critical issues pertain to the appropriate strategy for confounder adjustment. And this is what the science has struggled with for years, where confounders are complex, multifaceted constructs, and there's a need for greater clarity and transparency. And this is a person who, along with Dr. Needleman and others, represent some of the foundations academically, intellectually, historically, and politically of epidemiology and toxicology with regard to lead. If you look at some of the confounders in detail, particularly drugs are devastating to a lead case. absolutely devastating to a lead case. The negative effects of alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, whatever, combining those with other confounders, SESs, and what have you, it's very difficult to suggest that the literature consistently and appropriately isolates lead and makes a meta-analysis, I think, even more dubious. So, how did we get here? Why do there continue to be issues here? And I think it's obvious that a lot of it has to do with the nature of lead itself. The fact that it's ubiquitous in our environment, the fact that it's a legacy of the industrial age, and in some of the cases that we've had, we've gone back through the old Sanford maps and others, and we've been able to overlay historical industry on a city or a geography or whatever to talk about what was there before, what was being produced before, what may have contributed to soil lead and other things like that. And sometimes it's inexplicable. Here, for example, in Louisiana, when you look at the CDC publication regarding the percentage of children with elevated blood lead levels by county, what we find is down here in Plaquemines, you might know this from those who followed the storms in Louisiana. Right here, this community of fishermen has the highest percentage of blood lead exposed children in the entire state. Whereas here in New Orleans, where we have pre-war housing, obviously built with lead materials and whatever, it's not at the same level. So let me just go through this. All right. Okay. Is that it? Is that all on my slideshow? It looks like it, doesn't it? Well, okay. I'll make sure that we put in the materials, the other half of the slideshow. And to me, it was the most interesting and controversial part of it. Because one of the reasons why I think that we get to where we are is because of how we started. And if you look, as I mentioned before, if you looked at some of the original studies and some of the lions of the research, when you talk about Dr. Needleman, Dr. Bellinger, the early studies from Australia, and the discussion of lead, well, those experts started off talking about the history of lead, their assertions, and what it meant. The first time I ever read a report from Dr. Needleman, it contained an entire history of how lead probably contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. And then it went on to say that it also contributed to changes among the Greeks. Aha. I have my slideshow. And what we were able to see in those early experts were not that the claims were erroneous, but that they were broad and extensive, and they dealt with areas outside the issues of toxicology and epidemiology. And so those experts, those leaders in those areas were initially attacked. And they became litigation experts. And their statements were then recorded via depositions. And in this digital age, all statements are forever. And so as lead built upon the idea of a meta-analysis and other experts, the foundations of those experts could easily be shaken in cross-examination and presentations. And even recently, I just read the most recent study that came out that basically said, let's see if I got it, it says, the finding implicates early blood lead levels in the development of psychopathy and provides evidence that psychopathic tendencies are linked to toxokinetics associated with childhood lead poisoning. That study came out just recently. And that for deviant behavior in crime in France associated with elevated blood lead level. So the claims for lead continue to be broad and beyond the issues regarding IQ. I think my time is up. I do want to say that I think that even as a result of the CDC information, this continues to be a battle of experts. I think you'll continue to see the challenges to causation, and even though there was a statement of the sufficiency of the relationship between lead and IQ, it's going to continue to be a debate as to the causal relationship between those and a host of other confounders, particularly in the intense urban inner city communities where I practice, as to what, in fact, is causing the particular problems with regard to any child or group of children, presently, currently, historically, or otherwise. And it will include not only toxic insults, but also other SESs, of which most of you know there's an incredibly long list of those things that affect the development of children in our toughest and most impoverished communities. So thank you for having me, allowing me to share some perspectives with regard to the defense of these matters, and I'll make sure that the statements regarding lead and the associations between lead historically and otherwise are part of your package. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Well, it comes as no surprise to anybody that I disagree completely with virtually everything Roy had to say. I think it is overwhelmingly the case that the literature in the last 12 years has confirmed that lead is a highly poisonous neurotoxin that causes permanent brain damage to young children. It diminishes IQ, it causes attentional, organizational, and executive function problems, and contributes to causing delinquency and criminal behavior. I think the medical literature, at least across populations, is unequivocal in that regard. You notice that Roy did not cite to you any medical literature that actually contradicts the consensus that these documents that were discussed earlier talks about. That's because there is none. The medical literature is essentially unanimous and at lower and lower levels over the last 10 or 12 years. Regarding how that affects litigation, is a more nuanced question. It is certainly true that over the last 15 years, the level at which lead cases have been brought and settled and won at trial has continued to go down. I think that certainly cases in the teens are uniformly being brought and tried to significant verdicts and settled for significant amounts of money, and that's going to continue to happen. And this recent literature is certainly going to contribute to that trend continuing. Cases for lead levels below 10, between 5 and 10, or even below 5, I think it is unclear how that experience is going to play out. I certainly have not handled any of those cases. It's my understanding that in Baltimore and in New York, there are cases currently being litigated in that range, and how those come out will be an interesting thing to see. The CDC and the National Toxicology Program have made clear when they look through the literature that the peer-reviewed literature in dozens and dozens of cases, in dozens and dozens of countries over 5 or 6 continents, has continually shown these kinds of effects. Now, the question is, at trial, how is that impacted? It certainly is the case that in litigation and at trial, if plaintiffs' experts can testify about these consensus documents that show these kinds of effects of lead at levels below 10 and below 5, if you're litigating a case with lead levels in the range of 15 to 25, and you can say that this is 3 or 4 or 5 times the level at which these consensus documents have uniformly determined cause harm, that's powerful testimony. And the more of that literature that comes out, the more that testimony is going to be apparent. I'd like to reference just 2 of the many articles that have come out in the last number of years regarding the effect of lead at low levels. I think they're both in the National Toxicology Program document that I know is part of the materials that were distributed. One is entitled "Low-Level Lead Associated with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder." And that's a study in which the lead levels ranged from 0.5 to 3.5. And over those extraordinary low levels showed a scientifically significant increase in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the highest levels being 3.5. That's a dramatic change in what we understand about the levels at which lead causes harm. The other is an article entitled "Decreased Brain Volume in Adults with Childhood Lead Exposure." And this was a cohort of the kids from the Cincinnati study who are now adults. The mean blood lead level for those kids was 13.3, and the range was from 7 to 35. And with increased blood level, the Cincinnati group was able to show with pictures of the brain the decreased brain volume in certain areas of the brain as a result of this lead exposure. I think those are just 2 examples of the remarkably broad ways in which science and medicine have been able to document just how low the levels of lead that are necessary in order to cause long-term permanent harm are. And I think that those kinds of things will have a dramatic effect on how these cases are litigated. I think it is fair to say that, at least in my experience in the last number of years, we seldom hear that there's any dispute. That is, the defense is not able to find an expert to say there's a dispute across populations about lead at very low levels causing long-term permanent brain damage. The other defenses, which Roy alluded to, that is, blame the family, blame the neighborhood in which the kid grew up, talk about epidemiology, try and suggest that you can't extrapolate from a population study to an individual study. All of those defenses we do hear and will continue to hear. But in fact, the notion that the population studies are equivocal is something that we certainly don't see anymore. So in that sense, I think there has been a shift in the litigation. It's interesting that Roy was talking about Dalbert. At least in my experience in Massachusetts, I'm not aware of a plaintiff expert that has been excluded on Dalbert grounds. And we have routinely been able to exclude defense experts who we don't see anymore because they've been excluded so frequently, who have attempted to suggest that there's any equivocation about what the literature shows. So if a defense expert attempts to say, in the past, since we've been at this for a long time, absent encephalopathy, lead doesn't cause any harm, they're uniformly excluded. If they attempt to dispute the consensus of the medical literature regarding population studies, they've been excluded. I know that's true in Rhode Island. I know it's true in other places as well. So I couldn't disagree more with most of what Roy had to say. I guess that's why we have trials. So I know we have some time issues, and I know there are probably lots of questions and controversies, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We did have one question for the doctor. From a toxicology standpoint, as a toxicologist, what do you look at, or what is the process for determining whether a particular blood lead level relates to a recent exposure or perhaps an extended period of time that the child may have had that level before moving into a particular residency?
Well, I will disclaim. Is this on? I think.
Oh,
Yeah,
yep.
I guess it's on. Okay. I'm not a clinician, so I don't have a lot of experience with that particular question. But from a toxicological point of view, certainly you need to have, as I mentioned earlier, repeated blood lead measures to understand whether you've got increasing exposure or declining exposure. If you have the luxury of having some bone lead data, that can give you some insight into whether there have historically been substantial exposures in that person. Does that address the question?
I think so. Thank you.
So we have a couple of more questions, and then we'll get to the next session. Surprisingly, this comes from a defense attorney, and it is, do you believe that studies show that all children exposed to lead over 10 are injured?
That's aimed at me.
Yeah.
Well, see, my premise for accepting this engagement was that I wouldn't offer my specific opinions with regard to those issues. I'm going to duck that one.
Okay,
That's fair.
right. Well, and these next couple of questions, they're more general, and I'm sure you'll feel more comfortable. What is the basis of the estimate that 450,000 children have lead levels in excess of 5?
Is definitely an easier question. As I said, the national, I'm going to get my words all confused now today. The National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, while it clearly doesn't sample every person in the United States, is intended to be representative. So, it's analogous to those post-presidential debate polls that have a plus or minus X% error, that they extrapolate from the survey data and the NHANES survey to what the distribution of blood leads is in the entire population. That's what it's intended to represent. And so I interpret that to mean that there are 450,000 children who would be above the 97.5th percentile of the population.
And I think your answer kind of addresses this next question, which was, if the CDC revised policy is based on population estimates rather than statistics, I thought population estimates were statistics, but how is the change to 5 anything other than picking a number out of thin air, other than arbitrary?
I believe it represents a policy response to an inability of the committees to fully define the dose-response relation for effects of low-level lead for all these, and the dose response doesn't have to be the same for each effect. So, they weren't able to establish a threshold below which they were confident there were no adverse effects. They furthermore concluded that it was in society's interest to continue to reduce lead exposures in the population, and selecting a reference level that is defined as elevated within the population is a tool that they'll use to continue to reduce blood lead or lead exposures nationally. And that's my interpretation.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Panel.